A crise chegou. E agora? Agora você se informa, você pesquisa, você vê os números, você tenta ver o que vem amanhã. Agora você acompanha as lives e conteúdos diários do BTG Pactual, com grandes nomes do mercado sobre o agora. Disponíveis até para quem não é cliente. Acesse btgpactualdigital.com/lives.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Nitin. I'm here with Nitin Nohria. Nitin was born in India, has been Dean of Harvard Business School for 10 years, where he promoted a lot of transformation. Nitin made Harvard more focus on business ethics, more experimental, and especially more global, which is very good news for us here in Brazil and Latin America, because we have Harvard Business School has more than double the number of Brazilian students in the last 10 years, which is good news, and Nitin is one of the responsibles for that. But more than that, Nitin has been one of the most sophisticated corporate thinkers these days, and not only about management, strategy, business ethics, but especially about corporate transformation. And given this environment that we are in, I think will be a very interesting conversation. So once again, Nitin, it's a pleasure to be here with you for this informal conversation. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
It's great to be with you again, Andre. I wish I was with you in your office in Brazil. I still have wonderful memories of having been to São Paulo and been with you. So it's great to be with our Brazilian friends. It's a country that I truly love. So I am looking forward to the day when we can all travel again so that I can get an opportunity to visit again. But it's great to spend some time with you today. Thank you for inviting me.
Okay. Thank you for being here with us. And by the way, I see that you are in your office in Harvard Business School, which we could almost call home office, right? Because it's 100 yards from your house that you live in the campus, right? So
that's true. I'm one of those few people for whom the boundary between work and home has been 100 yards away in the last 10 years. So when this lockdown occurs, pretty much this is my home, this is my office, so it doesn't make that much difference to me.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a similar feeling too here, but anyway, well, Nitin, we have been under a completely unexpected and unthinkable scenario, right? We have, of course, the most important of the black swans, the unthinkable outbreak of the new coronavirus. That's bringing all sorts of transformation, challenge, fear to our societies, countries, business communities, and so on. But it's not only that, right? We had also other black swans, right? We had also unpredicted oil crisis, which is a supply and demand shock at the same time. In the oil market, which is probably the most important commodity globally. We had these China discussions, and that was coming before the whole pandemic, and the growth of China and the challenge of China, if you want, for certain parts of the West, including or especially US. So it's a number of black swans, and as we spoke earlier, it's too many black swans for the same lake. So given this environment, how you are seeing the globe, or let's start with big trends that some of them that were already with us. What do you think will accelerate, and what do you think will decelerate in terms of the big trends that we were seeing before?
So in some ways, Andre, I love this phrase of yours that this has been too many black swans in the same lake. And yet, even though this seems like a very unusual moment, and in some sense, it really is, right? That we've never, ever in human history had a moment in which these many countries have shut down at the same time. I was trying to think about even World War II, and in World War II, there used to be curfews, but the curfews never occurred all across the world at the same time. And this is one occasion on which we've literally had the entire world try and shut down in response to a global pandemic. So in many ways, this is a unprecedented and unusual moment, a true black swan event. On the other hand, I think that underneath the black swan event, what has come to the fore are some systemic issues that were with us before this event and have become much more sharply revealed as a result of it. So one thing, for example, that has been completely revealed is inequality. We were all concerned about inequality. And what you can see is in the United States, the people who are poor, the people who are African-American, the people who don't have any means of private transportation, who don't generally have access to good healthcare, those are the ones who have been most hurt by this pandemic. You find this true everywhere in the world. In my own home country of India, the people who live in the smallest houses where they have no ability to even social distance from themselves, who rely upon public transportation. You and I were joking that Prime Minister Modi asked everybody to go home, but how do they go home? They don't even have any opportunity to go home. So inequality, which had become such a large issue in society and was even causing people to question capitalism as a system, I think has been exposed even more deeply by this event. The other thing that has been exposed is geopolitical tensions. We were already living in a world in which, from an era in which globalization was something that we had all embraced, nationalism had come to the rise in many countries. And you would have thought that the pandemic would allow us to recognize that we live in one united world, right? Because this is clearly a virus that knows no boundaries. And yet, at this time, the boundaries of the world seem to have been even more sharply revealed. From countries fighting with each other to get PPE equipment, hoarding equipment. There was a time when, I don't know if you remember, early on in the crisis, there was almost like a global arms race going on about who could get more PPE from different people. A third kind of, and then of course the US supply tension has been revealed. The oil crisis has revealed that we actually are living in a world in which Chinese demand and emerging market demand was a very large part of what caused oil prices to be up. So there's a supply-demand imbalance there. We've discovered how fragile global supply chains are to these kinds of shocks. A system that we had all come to rely upon, which was the most efficient supply system in the world, has now seen to be fragile. And there has been for some time people in Silicon Valley and others have been saying that software will eat the world, and the digital transformation, that every business is digital, which was a long trend. But I think that this moment has shown us that perhaps it will indeed be true, that every business will have to become even more digital in the time forward. So while it's a black swan event in the moment, I actually think that what it has sharpened are some very deep structural issues that have been going on for a long time.
Yes. Well, since I would touch this topic later in our conversation, but since you mentioned inequality, as we speak, there are hundreds or maybe thousands of people in New York, in Times Square, protesting against these horrible events in Minneapolis, right? This is the same kind of protests going on in basically almost all big U.S. cities, and eventually this will spread even outside the U.S. This is related to, of course, a number of historical reasons, but probably more to this perception of inequality, even though that U.S. was quite successful in transforming itself in an up middle class country, right, with 300 million people, but that's the average, right? What do you think will be the developments of these protests, Nitin? Of course, it's unpredictable completely, but politically speaking, can it really bring some change can really be part of U.S. elections debate next year, this inequality debate?
I think that inequality has become, to my mind, one of the biggest political issues everywhere in the world, including the United States. And there is what we're seeing right now in terms of the race-related inequality issues that have come to the fore at this moment. That is, of course, a very unique, historic American challenge, that there have been African Americans and Black people in this country have been systematically persecuted for many, many years. They feel disenfranchised. They feel that the very institutions that are supposed to protect them, the police, the courts, the laws, are not protecting them. So you can understand this anger, because this is not the first time that this happened, right? In the last years and years, you see every few months an incident like this happens. But I think the reason why this moment has come to a boiling point is both the absolute horror of watching the video of this policeman putting his knee on the neck of a person who's saying, "I can't breathe," and doing that despite the person even being unresponsive, right? So just that image is such a vivid image that horrifies us. But you also, I think, have a community that has been bearing the brunt of the coronavirus. 1 in 3 people in the United States who have suffered from this coronavirus are Black. These are the same communities where there's been the highest unemployment, because as there has been a rise in unemployment in this country, there are often members of the Black community are often people who are in the kinds of jobs that have been displaced. So it's almost as if, again, to use your metaphor, it's a series of black swan events, which might look like black swan's event that hit simultaneously a community that has been hurting for a long time. So you can understand their anger. But I think that this anger is not just in the United States. I think we will find that there will be the same thing will be felt by people in many other parts of the world. So in India, for example, migrant workers, who are a very large part of the workforce in India, they travel from state to state in construction jobs. And as you know, construction and many other parts of the economy have been shut down. Those people are engaging in very similar kinds of protests in that country. So I actually think that my hope is that this moment will remind us that those of us who care about capitalism, who care about business, and who care about business continuing to do well, will recognize that business does well when everyone in society does better. And for too long, it seems like business has been doing well, but not everybody in society is being lifted by the benefits of business. And my hope is that this will be a moment that will cause businesses to think harder about how do we create more well-paying jobs for a larger number of people. How do we as business people, as opposed to just relying upon government, provide better healthcare to our employees? How do we provide better education? I actually think that this is a time in which business will have to play a little bit more of the role that government has historically played.
Yeah, still on the same topic, where do you think business leaders are in US in terms of being aware of this challenge, of our responsibility? And I'll give you an interesting example from Brazil. As you know, Brazil doesn't have a culture of philanthropy, but the coronavirus crisis has brought probably what was the most important philanthropy wave ever from the private sector here. So Brazil, year to date, has donated more than 2 times the whole size of yearly donations. I'm talking about corporate responsibility, right? We have, which is quite positive, right? I'm proud of what we are doing and our peers are doing here. And maybe it's the beginning of a different moment where people are much more aware of this challenge. Of course, here in Brazil, you have challenges everywhere that you see. It's impossible to fix everything at the same time. But where do you think business leaders in US are regarding this challenge? People aware of that? I'm not talking about all the normal corporate responsibilities or nice charts or comments in quarter results. I'm talking about really understanding the challenge of the society.
So I think,
I'm asking you because you're a privileged observer of, you talk to all the relevant business leaders in US.
so I think that, we all learned of the Business Roundtable declaration that came out earlier, in which many business leaders banded together and said that the purpose of business is to serve all stakeholders and not just privileged shareholders over everyone else. This is not to say that shareholders are unimportant, but I think that declaration that was signed by so many members of the Business Roundtable was itself, to my mind, a pretty important shift. And I think the coronavirus and this particular moment is going to cause that commitment to become more real. When I think people signed that, I'm not sure how many people signed it with a real commitment. My hope is that this moment will make that commitment more real. So you're already seeing examples, companies that take a good example would be a company like Walmart, which is one of the largest employers in the United States. During this period, they have decided to employ more people. They've increased wages. They've made more commitments to healthcare. And this is a company that historically, because of its commitment to low prices, used to always feel that the customer was the person that they would always privilege first and squeeze everybody else in their ecosystem, whether it was getting the lowest prices from their suppliers, whether it was making sure that wages were the lowest they could be. And I think that even a firm like Walmart has recognized that while it remains committed to this idea of delivering low-priced goods to its customers, unless it creates an ecosystem in which everyone thrives, their very customers are the people who have to actually do well. Otherwise, they're not going to be good customers for them too. So it's so you see firms, and I'm just using that as one example, where people are getting much more serious that if the society around them is not doing well, then the likelihood that they will do well in the long run is going to be diminished. So I actually think that this will be one of the more lasting changes that comes out of this moment, which is business will more deeply start to embrace the role it has in trying to improve the prosperity of everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nitin, changing a little bit topics, but still on the pandemic, and we talked about supply chains, right? And we talk about this natural competition of U.S. and China. And more, it was accepted and recommended, and almost a prejudice in the country that supply chains should be outsourced to the lowest cost geography, right? With the pandemic, and you mentioned a few minutes ago, the dispute around equipment, simple equipments like masks or respirators or simple things that could be manufactured anywhere, but they were suddenly manufactured very distant from home. Do you think this environment for us will change the way that the corporate sector was managing the supply chains in a relevant way? Part of that could even happen from a regulatory way, right? Like defense or medical equipment, but even on everything else. Do you think we can see a significant reshuffle the way that the world was searching for productivity?
So I'm sure you've been having these conversations with the CEOs that you know. I was on a Zoom call just 2 weeks ago with about 20 CEOs of some of the most important global companies headquartered in the United States. And when I was asking them, what do you think will change permanently as a result of this crisis, that once you're through this crisis, because during the crisis, a whole bunch of people have made changes, which by now everybody knows, working virtually, trying to do all of the, moving more things digital. But I think the two most permanent changes that people thought would come out of this is, one, supply chain reconfiguration. Every one of them felt that they would now place more emphasis on building more resilient supply chains with more local supply sources and not being as dependent on a single source. It doesn't mean that everything will be made, for example, by a United States person in the United States, but they might use Mexico, they might use China, they might use India, they might use Cambodia, they might also use some manufacturing in the United States. So I think people were beginning to say that there was too much concentration of supply chains in one or two locations in the world, and they would like to create more resilient supply chains so that whether it's a pandemic or there are other kinds of shocks, I think people have become now even more sensitive to the idea that there may be climate-related shocks. We're beginning to see wildfires. We're beginning to see severe climate events that occur in different parts of the world. So all of these things, I think, have created a sensitivity to make sure that supply chains will become, I think, there'll be more dispersion in supply chains and more countries. In fact, in some ways, this may be an opportunity for places like Brazil and Mexico and Latin America in terms of becoming supply sources to places like the United States and other parts of the world.
Yeah, certainly the currency in our region is helping, right?
Yeah.
Politics, not necessarily, but everything around here is cheaper. But I do think this movement or this trend can go as far as a way that combined with certain level of nationalism create a productivity issue for the world, or not necessarily?
So I think that the reality will be the supply chains will become more expensive. It's very hard for me to imagine that this will lead to a world. We currently have a very, very efficient supply chain situation in the world. And I think that this resilience and this local pressure that will build up as a result of the pandemic, both a combination of real risks that business people will want to avoid, but also the political pressure, the combination of people trying to avoid the real risks of disruptions that they have seen, plus the political pressure to be more local, will inevitably make supply chains, to my mind, a little bit less efficient, but maybe more reliable. So you'll have to trade off some level of efficiency for reliability. And I'm not sure it would add a lot to the price in the end, but I would not be surprised if supply chains on average increased about 10% of the cost of goods in terms of the components that we put in almost anything that we buy today.
Yeah. Well, these would suggest in normal times that we should expect some inflation ahead of us, right? Which apparently is an extinct animal, right? I don't want to go deeper here in economics, but a lot of people have been, and a lot of respectable money managers have been talking about the markets ahead of the fundamentals in the economy or the uncertainties or whatever. But and the fact is, if you look at the financial assets price in US or even in other countries, with the exception of emerging market currency, prices are relatively well behaved given the size of the uncertainty ahead of us, the economic downturn that we are under. What's your take on why financial assets prices are behaving so well against even the analysis of very respectable people like Druckenmiller or others? I know it's a little bit of an unfair question because you are not a portfolio manager or a trader, but you're a bright mind, so I will ask anyway.
No, I think that, everywhere in the world, we have seen a level of monetary easing. And certainly since the US is the reserve currency of the world and the Federal Reserve seems determined to essentially buy anything and to backstop all types of credit, I actually think that it's this persistence of quantitative easing and almost flooding the market, which is leading to asset prices being high. I mean, if essentially the cost, we all know that in the end, all asset prices is a risk premium over whatever is the risk-free asset price. And if the risk-free asset, which is US Treasury, is trading at zero, then everything at some point you can put any discount rate on zero and prices look very good. So I think that to me, the lessons that were learned after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009 are now being applied very aggressively to try and save the financial system this time around. And to my mind, perhaps excessively aggressively. But nevertheless, you see that policy in the United States, but you're seeing that policy everywhere in the world. It's almost as if monetary policy rather than the real economy is driving financial markets right now. To just give you a little example, Andre, I had a meeting of our alumni on May 12th, okay? Not very many weeks ago. 2,000 of our alumni joined a call like this, and I asked them for a little poll. So in the poll, I asked them, what do you think will be the impact of the global economy as a result of this current combination of black swan events? So I said, how many of you think that this will be a V-shaped recovery by January 2021? 9% of 2,000 people said that this will be a V-shaped recovery. I said, how many of you think this will be a recession that will last about a year? 45%. And how many of you think this will be a protracted recession that will last longer? 46%. Okay, so half the people are almost predicting that this will be a long-lived recession. These are all business people. These are my alums. This is not a poll of the average citizen in the country. So I will say that this is a group that is responding, which is involved in business on a daily basis, right? So these are people who are running their own businesses in many cases. And then I asked them, what do you think will happen to the S&P 500 by September of 2020? How many of you think it will rise by 10%? 15% said it would rise by 10%, even by September, though all of them think that even the recession will be occurring. 37% think that it'll be at its current level, plus minus 10%. And only 40% felt it would decline. So there is, even amongst business people, that is my alumni, there is a disconnect between what they think will happen in the real economy and what they anticipate will happen in the markets.
Yeah, it's like all the markets have puts against the central banks in a certain way or format, right? And meanwhile, we have around 15 trillion of bonds trading at negative rates, right? Which is again, it's not a management discussion; it's an economic or financial discussion, but probably one of the most disturbing of our times, right? It's a very strange situation, right? Negative interest rates. I think not as studied as not enough is studied yet. And part of the reason why people financial assets think that financial assets will perform well even during recession times probably is related to that, right? Yeah.
But I had Ray Dalio on your in one of your meetings or not, but of course he truly believes that there are these very long run credit cycles, which at some point, eventually you can overdo it. And he thinks that the US in particular has been now taking excessive advantage of being the reserve currency of the world and printing money in a way that will, in the long run, weaken it relative to China. So he's very worried about whether this credit cycle is one of the other ways in which the tensions between the US and China will continue to increase over time, because the people keep, in a sense, allowing the US to issue this much credit because there's still confidence in the US economy. At some point, if that starts to falter, that could be a dangerous moment in terms of what we think about the change in geopolitical balance of the world. And at least Ray Dalio is very concerned about whether there'll be a longer run price to pay. His worry is, look, in the short term, what the Fed is doing is very good because it's allowing the markets to be stable and is allowing asset prices to be good. But at some point, this level of monetary easing might have its price.
Yes, and if you go back, just to complement this reflection, it's if you go back 500 years of financial history, well-documented financial history, there is always a way of capitalism, even before the world was created, of punishing those with capital and not necessarily with business or risk-taking or working. And for different reasons, right? Wars, big inflation, hyperinflations, devaluations, and maybe we are entering in the moment of negative interest rates, right? That's a new format of punishment. Let's see. It's a good reflection. Probably we need to do a lot of them for the next years. Changing topics a little bit, Nitin, talking about the society, and of course, this crisis moved all of us, and people have been thinking, and new dilemmas came to action, right? In a country like US that respects freedom, democracy, and all the liberal democrats' values, you have an interesting discussion about, well, let's trace everybody and have a perfect tracking and be much more effective for the next outbreak. But on the other hand, well, we are free to go everywhere, and we need to keep our privacy, and that's a constitutional right above everything else. Where do you think will be this discussion, right? Being more effective and give up some freedom, or freedom is too important for any concession here? Where do you think, or how do you think will be this debate in American society?
So look, it's interesting that the role model that we have all seemed to have come up with in the country that dealt with the coronavirus in a way that people look up to is South Korea, right? In South Korea, there was no national lockdown. On the other hand, they had the best system of contact tracing because they allowed the citizens voluntarily allowed themselves to join a contact tracing system. And as a result of that, as soon as someone got the disease, they were taken away and asked to quarantine themselves. Now, it's also a society in which people tend to be obedient. When the state tells them to quarantine themselves, then they will quarantine themselves. I'm trying to think about if in Brazil or in India or in the United States, the state said to you, you should do this. I'm not sure that every citizen would instantaneously follow what the state's orders would be. So I think it does also depend a little bit on the general culture of a country. So, you take Japan, for example, which has had so few incidents, and that's because the people themselves, if you've ever traveled to Japan, you'll notice on any normal day, well before the coronavirus, 10% of the people would wear masks. So their mask wearing was a very common thing because people in general felt that if they were ill or if they had a flu, they would wear a mask to prevent it from spreading to other people. So I think it will be an interesting moment to see whether this deep concern about privacy, which became such a big deal in the United States, where people like Facebook and others were being challenged, and GPRS was enacted in Europe, and there was talk about whether there would be a similar privacy regulation that would come in the US. At least for now, all those privacy conversations seem to have died down. People are a little bit more of the view that in this current moment of fear, that if contact tracing is one of the ways in which we can get back to work, then maybe we'll be open to contact tracing. I generally think that will not last. My view of this is that the current willingness to be a little bit more permissive about giving your data to others will not last. I actually think that there is a deeper concern around privacy that in the end will end up remaining more true than we might imagine. So when people think that this moment is going to eliminate the concerns that people have had about privacy and now everybody will be very quick to share their data, I'm not so sure. I think that we will end up having, maybe companies will end up having to find a way to each of us, as so Harvard Business School is thinking about what contact tracing software it will use. We may have to assure our employees that the contact tracing that we will use will not allow their data to be shared easily with other people. So there may end up having to be new protocols in which people will give their data in some ways, but there will be more assurance that the data will not be used for commercial purposes. It will only be used for contact tracing in a health kind of crisis. It's not easy to do those things, but I think that that's at least where some of the pressure will come for new kinds of information systems to be developed.
Yeah. Well, Nitin, moving a little bit to the biomedical side of the moment, right? And neither of us are doctors or scientists, but both of us have been talking to scientists and doctors more than ever in the recent 90 days, right? And I know that you have been talking to them, and I'm the same. At this stage, and sometimes it's good that we have business people reflecting about all the data that we got from scientists. And at this stage, Nita, it's a biomedical question, and I would like you reflecting as an analyst to that more than a specialist, of course. What's your take on if we look at the pandemic? How you see the outline of looking at what happened to China, what happened to Europe, then the epicenter moved to US. Now, unfortunately, it's here in Latin America, in Brazil. How you see the evolution, or the most likely evolution, based on everything that you studied? What are the outlines or the borderlines of the pandemic? What's your best personal take? Again, as an analyst, I know that you are not a doctor or a scientist, but I know that you have been talking to very smart people in Harvard about that.
Yeah, so, as you know, I don't, maybe for your viewers, Boston is one of the real epicenters of the healthcare community in the United States. We have 20% of all people who have postdoctorates in the life sciences actually work and live in Boston. So it's in the United States. So it's a pretty dense cluster of healthcare professionals. So I end up being surrounded by people who have more expertise in this than I could ever have. So what I take from them are the following conclusions. One, the rate at which vaccines are being developed is unprecedented. And most people say that even though in the past, there are some things for which vaccines have yet not been developed, right? So SARS, MERS, there are still many viruses for which vaccines many years later have yet not been discovered. Yet there's a very high level of optimism amongst the people I know that by the end of this year or by early next year, there will be vaccines available for the coronavirus. So that's one promising development, which I think, and you've seen early positive results in clinical trials. There's the Moderna trial, there's the trials that Merck has done. So there are at least 3 companies that already have had some positive trials with the coronavirus. And there are currently, by some estimates, more than 300 clinical trials on vaccines that are underway. So I think on the vaccines side, there is hope, but I would be careful to say that even if we get a vaccine by next summer, that will be a miracle relative to the previous development of vaccines. So some people are saying to me, it might come by January, February, but my own estimate is that it will be by about this time next year that vaccines will not just have been developed, but be widely available. Because once you develop them, you still have to manufacture them in quantity. You have to distribute them. You have to make them available. There we'll run into supply chain issues too. So one interesting question is that if a vaccine develops, who gets to get it first? That'll be an interesting challenge that we will see with vaccines as well. On cures, there is again very promising news. There is clearly evidence that there are a range of promising cures that are under development, so that at least people who contract the disease are unlikely to have it become a death sentence, which is really important, right? Right now, I think one of the reasons why we all went into lockdown is that we were concerned that if people got the disease, they would have to go to ICUs, they would have to live on ventilators for up to 2 or 3 weeks. There would be no capacity in any hospitals to handle the number of people who would be sick. But if you can treat people early and prevent them from getting to ICUs or having to get onto respirators, which now there seems to be some opportunity to do, it at least makes the risk of the disease in terms of whether it becomes a death sentence less problematic. So that feels hopeful too. I think the place on which there is widespread disagreement is whether there will be a second wave or not. So if you ask me, where is there no consensus? There's no consensus amongst the epidemiologists. There are people who say that this will be like the Spanish flu and the second wave will be worse than the first. There are people who say with the summer months coming, the coronavirus is going to lose steam. There are people who say that there's enough basic immunity in the world right now that this will stay at this current level, which seems to be a manageable level for a long time, and then decline. So when you talk to epidemiologists, that's where I find myself most confused. It's not at all clear to me that there is any model yet that I believe predicts what will be the course of the disease.
Yeah, well, since this is probably the most interesting topic for our audience here, our summary of reflections and analysis here is similar to yours in number of points. We think, given the low level of mutations in the virus, a vaccine is a given. Not easy to predict when. The most advanced tests are in very different technology for vaccines, so more secure in the 12 months. And as you said, you require an infrastructure, logistics, supply chains to make really available for relevant population. So good news, we agree with you that we have a vaccine. Bad news, I don't think it's so close as some of these tests suggest. In terms of the cure, we have positive news, but we don't believe in any groundbreaking discovery. We think there will be some discrete improvements with new drugs and this and that, or even old drugs that are being used in a more effective way, like corticoids or others that can be effective or well used against COVID-19. So we think we are improving. Even the use of respirators, we are improving the way that we manage them. So this is good news, but no cure. What I think we are getting more positive is the immunization of the population. Right? It's we are with those that don't believe in the seasonality of the virus, right? Or very low seasonality. If you look at the seasonal virus, are those more vulnerable to temperature or humidity or a combination of both, right? If you take the example of Brazil, it's a very good example on the opposite side, right? The North region or the Amazon region was the most affected region in the country, right? It's and the South, that is dry and colder, is the less affected region. So it's different than the virus of the normal flu virus. So we don't think seasonality is relevant here, but eventually the immunization of the population is higher than what we imagine, right? When you look at what happened in New York, and in a certain way happened in the north of Brazil, it's a similar strategy, which is the same strategy of Congo, which is no strategy, right? It's it's difficult. Maybe 10 years from now, we will discover what is the best strategy to manage the situation. But our view on the disease is not as different than yours. We are more constructive, even though that we cannot celebrate easier time ahead of us. Nitin, I will move to another topic that you are a specialist, right? As I said in the beginning, you have been managing Harvard Business School for 10 years, and I want to bring education to the table. And well, each crisis brings a new learning on what are the next steps for education. So what we learned here, of course, we have the absolutely increase on home office, home learning, but how it will really change education, or at least what are the debates in Harvard around that at this moment, or the reflections around the transformation in the education at this moment?
So I think the one way to think about what's happened to education, I think, is actually might also be useful for any other business to think about, which is, education was historically a very bundled product. And what I mean by bundled is that there is a part of education which is about imparting people with a body of knowledge, right? It's making sure that in business, marketing, and production and operations management, and finance, and accounting. It's the things that you have to impart to people that allow them at the end of a period of education to do a test and to show on that test that they know more now than they knew before, right? So you have to convey a body of knowledge to people in education. In In K through 12 education, that's making sure that you know how to do math and you know how to do reading and you can do your. So what we're learning is that the analytic component of education can be done very well online. The resistance that people had to think that what you can learn analytically can only be done in a classroom, I think is being fundamentally challenged by this moment, because we've now run an experiment on a global scale. Of course, here too, inequality ends up being important. You need to have great online instructors, just like you needed to have great instructors in a classroom, and you need to create the technology for the students on the other side. You know, if you're living in a place with no bandwidth, no computers, no capability, versus children, you know, like our children who have access to the best computers and full bandwidth and full Wi-Fi, we've seen that inequality has struck education in this moment just as it used to strike education in other settings. But the analytic component is very easily done online. What is missing is the social component. And we all know from our own educational experience that education is not just about learning how to do math. Education is also learning about yourself. It's developing friendships. It's comparing yourself with other people in a classroom to know what are your strengths and weaknesses, learning how to leverage your strengths, to work with others who might be different from you, to find a way collectively to leverage their strengths and to overcome your weaknesses. It's about the chance meeting that you have where you sit with someone at lunch whom you would never have met otherwise, who then becomes your best friend. All these things, which are, you know, for us as teachers, we used to think that it's tempting to think that the most important part of education is what happens when I, as a teacher, am standing in front of students. What we are learning through this moment is that what happens when we are not in front of the students, but in life outside, what happens in the playground, what happens on a playing field, what happens at a lunch table, what happens when people just talk to each other outside of class, is such an important part of education. That's what our students are missing. And so I actually think that when the opportunity comes for coming back, people will come back to education for the social experience. But over time, we will get better at delivering the analytic components of what we do in a hybrid model. We will have some kind of education that we will deliver online, and we will reserve for in-person education the things that really require a discussion, things that are more subtle, you know, the kinds of things that we do in the case method at Harvard Business School. But giving a lecture, there's absolutely no reason why a lecture should be given to someone live with them present in the classroom. We can have far better transmission of that kind of knowledge in an online way. And, you know, each of us at work are learning the same things, like which meetings do you really need to be present in person? Probably only 20% of our meetings require us to be present in person. I think we've all learned through this moment that many meetings are shorter, more efficient, and more productive to just do online. And it's only certain kinds of meetings where you really have to debate, where you need to see other people in the eye, where you have to learn from the body language what's going on. Those are the kinds of meetings that we really need to do in person. I think in general, we are all learning that this moment has taught us that we have to be more thoughtful about what truly needs to be done in person and what can be done online. And in my judgment, education going forward will forever become more hybrid. I don't think it will become totally online. I do think that there are some very important features, particularly the social aspect of education that requires us to be with each other. But there are many, many things that will permanently become online.
Yeah, Nitin, just before we go back to education, where I will finish our conversation, translating this to the business and business environment, what are the changes, not in terms of business strategy, but the way that we manage our business? Some companies are talking about transforming themselves totally in a home office approach. How you are seeing that? What will be the new optimal?
So I have been blown away by how aggressive some of the leading companies have been about now saying that people can work from home. So full disclosure, I used to serve on the board of Tata Sons and Tata Consultancy Service, which I know operates in Brazil as well, hires hundreds of thousands of people everywhere in the world. Their estimate is that they will only have about 25% of their people ever come back to work. Okay, this is a company that has hundreds of thousands of people. Facebook just announced that it would also encourage its entire workforce to work from home for extended periods of time if they choose to. So I think it'll be not uncommon for people to work maybe 4 days a week from home and 1 day a week from the office, or to have certain kinds of people who permanently work from home, a small number of people who permanently work from the office. I actually believe that this will probably be the most lasting change that comes out of the pandemic, which is the difference between the number of people who will work from home and the number of people who work from the office will permanently change. I don't think, some people today estimate that 80% of the work will come from home and 20% of the work will occur from the office. My own estimate is that it'll be more like 50-50 or 60% from the office and 40% from home. So I don't think it'll be 80% from home and 20% in the office, but it could be 50-50. If I was a commercial real estate person, that has huge consequences. If I was, I actually think it'll be interesting to see what happens to family life when people are working from home. This could be a profound change in even how we think about society as a whole, because we forget how much of our life is structured by the fact that we spend most of our waking hours actually at work and only some of our hours at home. When that changes itself. So I actually think that this may be the most profound change that comes out of this coronavirus in terms of the nature of not just work, but the nature of home, because we all forget that home used to be a place that was different from work. And now that's going to become our place of work as well. So thinking through all of that is not something that I have fully come to terms with, but I think that this is where we're going to see the most profound change potentially in society.
Yeah, interesting reflection. I agree with you. And going back to education, Nitin, it's Harvard is the leading executive education place in the world, and most famous MBA and so on. And each crisis brings, as I said before, some transformation, right? We had the Enron scandal in the past, and this brought a lot of business ethics in the normal curriculum of executive education. What this crisis will change for business education? What will be needed to be taught in the classroom of business education, online or offline?
So we think that there will be at least 3 kinds of topics that will end up being a very important part of business education going forward. One will be that, we have already in the last decade been teaching more about the digital transformation of companies. I think the demand to teach how digital transformation of companies will continue will only increase, because I do think that this crisis will continue the acceleration of this idea that every business in the end is going to be more like a digital business. So this is going to be true of every imaginable business in the world, and the way we deal with our consumers, the way we deal with our employees will become more digital. So learning how to run a digital business is going to become more important for all business people. The second thing that we believe will be important is that we will have to teach people what it means to lead in an environment in which all your employees are not with you in a physical setting. As you have to operate in a world in which, in some ways, globalization had already produced this challenge, right? Like, as people were trying to manage employees in many different locations all around the world, there was already a challenge of how to lead when everybody in your organization is not face to face with you. I mean, you and I are lucky, right? Most of our people work with us in one building and we can see them. And it's so much easier to manage when we can walk down to someone's office and have a conversation with them. We'll have to learn, so people used to talk about managing by walking around. It's going to be hard to manage by walking around. We'll have to manage by zooming around or some other thing in the world, right? So we'll have to figure out a new human resource, because in some ways, if managing is about leading people in this new world will become a very different kind of challenge, and we'll have to teach people how to do that. And the last thing is, I will come back to where I started. I actually think that one of the most important things that we will have to teach students now is how can business not just do the work of business, but also play a more beneficial role in society. How do you do your business and simultaneously create better jobs? How do you do your business and simultaneously do a better job of taking care of the healthcare of your people? How do you do business and address the educational needs of society? How can business start to change some of these concerns about inequality that have become so salient and present in society more generally and have been exposed so deeply by this coronavirus? I don't think that business knows how to do these things, right? Like, we historically have just thought about that as philanthropy. There's not enough philanthropy in the world that is going to solve this problem. In the end, unless we make this a part of the natural cycle of profit generation, because profit generation is the only thing that is a sustainable flywheel, in my view, in society. I don't think that we can pay enough taxes for government to solve these problems, nor do I think government is terribly effective at solving all these problems. At least we've seen that in the last decade. So what role can business play in solving social problems? It's not a question that we have ever asked before, because we used to always say that the job of business is to produce a decent profit. Through that, it pays taxes. And then other institutions in society, government, NGO, would take care of all of these problems. We had some role, but our role was more limited. I think business will have to expand the definition of its own boundaries to start to take these problems seriously and see if there are business models that are viable that will allow you to address these problems. We're already seeing this with the environment, right? Like, people used to think that solving environmental problems for business would be adding costs. But we've actually seen that, just like with the quality movement in the 1980s, when we reduced quality, we could actually when we improved quality, we could reduce costs. I think businesses are now learning that if they reduce their environmental footprint, they can actually reduce costs in the long run, as opposed to necessarily have to increase costs. In the same way, we'll have to take on other societal challenges and find a way for business to address those societal challenges in a way that over time makes businesses more profitable. Because unless the profit cycle is a part of these solutions, they won't expand and they won't be scalable. To my mind, only solutions that produce a profit are scalable. No other solutions are scalable in the long run, because profit is the engine that scales a dynamic economy. I don't quite know what are all the answers for how to do that, but this is where I think business education will have to go, so that we can generate a group of business leaders who will start to address these more fundamental problems in society.
Yeah. Well, it's a very good answer, Nitin. And a related question, do you think other challenge, or the key challenge, which I think is the climate change, with the experience that humanity had with the pandemic, it will be more in our agenda, given that now we probably will consider that unthinkable things can happen, or given that we gave a little bit of a vacation of this problem of excess carbon economy in the last 60 days, it will be, we're not talking about that. It's not our priority. How do you see this relevant issue, maybe the most important of all, of climate change in this scenario of pandemic? It will be more on our agenda or less in our agenda, do you think?
So I'm optimistic. I think this will be more on our agenda. Again, you may have seen these things. I don't know whether there are pictures like this in Sao Paulo, but I was sent pictures from the place that I went to school in, which was New Delhi. New Delhi in India is one of the most polluted cities in the world. It's, in fact, at times has pollution levels that are greater than Beijing. And people sent me pictures just 1 month into the lockdown in New Delhi. They had shown pictures of the same site, literally photographs. And you can see the photographs, and it's as if in one, the camera had a brown film on it, and in the other case, the camera was clear. It's as if the air had cleared in the city just with 1 month of traffic and pollution having been diminished on the streets just by the cars. So I think people hopefully will have recognized that, yes, we do want to return to work. I don't wish for cars to not return to the seat, or people to not be back at work, and to have an economy that's humming again. But hopefully we'll become more attentive to the real need for us to reduce the carbon footprint of the world. And we will find that that crisis, which is waiting to happen, just like other pandemics that are likely to happen, we will become more conscious of trying to avoid, because the risk of these things has now become so much more clear to us. So at least I'm optimistic that it may not happen immediately, but we will see in the next few years a greater and greater energy on an incremental basis. So I don't think it'll be a step change, but I see a slope that will actually be a positive slope over time in terms of people addressing these longer term issues, especially the issue of climate change and reducing the carbon density today of the economy.
Yeah, yeah. Onita, final, very simple question regarding education. It's do you have any answer for these anxious parents over here that want to know if Harvard and the other American schools will be open in September? We already can see, me included, by the way, we can already have some forecasts on that.
So I think that it is, I can tell you what we are planning to do at Harvard Business School. Our view of this is that if there is any opportunity to safely return our students to campus, we will try to do that. So we're not looking to keep the school closed, but we operate in a world in which regulation has some consequences. So for example, if there continue to be by the fall a requirement that people have to be 6 feet apart, and we cannot bring them into higher density. Just to give you some example of the challenge that we will have, Andre, we looked at our classrooms. A typical classroom at Harvard Business School, our case method classroom, seats 96 people. If we had to maintain 6 feet of distance between every student, we could only have today 30 students at most in our classroom. So merely the existing infrastructure, unless things are completely relaxed, it will be very hard to deliver an education to all our students in person. So we are even preparing for a model in which some students will be in the class, some students will learn virtually. We may have to rotate who is in class and who is virtually till things ease to the point that everybody can be in class at the same time. Like you, I am praying that the opening up that is occurring in the world will not cause the coronavirus to rise again. And in fact, the flattening of the curve that we have seen and the decline, in fact, that we have seen will remain that way. Because if it remains that way, then I think even by the end of the summer, people might be more comfortable to start to live a more normal life again. And we won't have the very strict restrictions today that we operate under, because I can't make rules at Harvard that are not consistent with what the directives are from our governor and our mayor. Today, we are unable to open the school because we couldn't open it in a way that would be consistent with the current distancing and gathering rules. But I am very, very keen and hopeful that we will, in fact, be able to have students back on our campus. And this campus was designed for people to be here and to live with us. So I'm very much praying for that outcome. And you've been here, Andre, so you know our campus, you know how beautiful it is and how it's really not, it is at its best when our students are with us, and we're hoping for that moment to arrive, as we hope for every other business in the world. I think that all of us who are business people care to have this economy back to normal, and it is only back to normal when the threat of the coronavirus starts to recede and we can create enough public consciousness of safety that business can resume.
Yeah. Well, Nitin, thank you very much for the conversation. As always, an intelligent, deep, and nice conversation. So it's a pleasure being with you. I hope to be in person with you soon, that we are both allowed to do that. And again, congratulations for the amazing job in Harvard during all these years, and for all of us, and how many business leaders you have been educating in the last 10 years. So thank you very much for this nice chat.
Andre, thank you so much for having me. For anybody who's in the audience who is from Harvard Business School, I thank you for joining. For those of you who are not from Harvard Business School or from other parts of Harvard, I thank you for joining. And in general, to all of you, thank you for taking the time. It means the world to me that you joined us today. And I wish you good health, and most importantly, a wonderful recovery. And I hope that all of us can return to life that begins to feel a little bit more normal again.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye, Nitin.
Bye-bye.
A crise chegou. E agora? Agora você se informa, você pesquisa, você vê os números, você tenta ver o que vem amanhã. Agora você acompanha as lives e conteúdos diários do BTG Pactual, com grandes nomes do mercado sobre o agora. Disponíveis até para quem não é cliente. Acesse btgpactualdigital.com/lives.